A police officer walked into the town square one freezing morning and stopped dead in his tracks because chained on the auction block was a German shepherd with eyes full of battle scars and silent pleas. This was no ordinary dog. This was a former canine, once a hero, now treated like property to be sold to the highest bidder. He didn't plan to interfere, but in that moment, something in those eyes pulled him forward, changing both their lives forever. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe every loyal dog deserves a loving home, not a life in chains, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see the world. Snow came down in slow, deliberate flakes, drifting over the narrow streets of Cedar Falls like a curtain being drawn across the world. The town was small 2 blocks of brick and timber buildings huddled together at the base of the Rockies, the kind of place where winter came early and stayed late, and where the wind always carried the smell of pine and chimney smoke. It was mid-morning, the pale winter sun hanging low behind a bank of clouds, and the air had that sharp bite that seeped through even the thickest coat. Officer Ethan Cole pulled his patrol SUV into the angled slot outside Rosie's Cafe, the tires crunching over icy slush. Ethan was 36, broad-shouldered, with the steady build of someone who had spent years on the job and still kept himself in shape. His hair was dark brown, kept short under the brim of his patrol cap, and a dusting of stubble traced the line of his jaw. His eyes, gray, steady, and unreadable, had once carried more warmth, but 3 winters ago his wife, Anna, had died in a car accident on an icy highway, and that warmth had gone with her. Since then, Ethan had become quieter, more guarded, his sense of humor buried beneath layers of routine and solitude. His badge was polished, his uniform crisp, but there was a heaviness in his posture that no amount of discipline could hide. He shut off the engine, bracing against the wind as he stepped out. The cold nipped at his cheeks, the sky a dull, bruised gray overhead. He was coming off a long patrol shift, 8 hours of slow, lonely roads and the occasional radio call about a fallen tree or a stranded driver. Rosie's Cafe was a refuge on days like this. Warm coffee, a plate of eggs if he felt like it, and a brief moment to thaw out before heading home. The cafe itself was a squat, single-story building with frost lacing the windows and a red door that stuck if you didn't shoulder it just right. Ethan had one gloved hand on the door handle when something on the bulletin board caught his eye. Nailed over a faded flyer for a church bake sale and a notice about firewood delivery was a fresh, stark sheet of paper. Bold, black letters read, "Seized Asset Auction. Court Order, Glenn County. 1. Male German Shepherd, former Canine Unit, name Ranger." Underneath, smaller print noted, "Auction to be held at Cedar Falls Town Square, Saturday, 10 a.m." Ethan's brow furrowed. It wasn't unusual for the county to auction seized property from criminal cases, cars, tools, sometimes even livestock, but a former canine was another matter entirely. His gaze lingered on the name. Ranger. He felt something stir, a faint, unwelcome tug of memory. Years back, Ethan had partnered briefly with a German shepherd named Duke before Duke's handler returned from deployment. The bond had been instant silent communication, mutual trust. Seeing a canine's name on a paper like this made his stomach knot. He reached out, tracing the edge of the notice with a gloved finger, the cold making the paper feel brittle. "That mutt? Ain't worth the trouble," a voice said from behind him. Ethan turned slightly to see Jim Keller, a local in his late 50s with a permanent slump to his shoulders, leaning in the doorway. Jim wore a battered brown coat and a trucker cap pulled low. His cheeks were red from the cold, his nose bulbous from years of whiskey. Jim chuckled, shaking his head. "Heard about that dog. Came from some drug gang out east, mean as they come. Nobody's gonna want him except maybe to guard a junkyard." Ethan didn't answer, just gave a short nod and pushed the cafe door open. Inside, Rosie's Cafe was warm and dim, smelling of coffee and cinnamon rolls. The windows were fogged from the heat, and the hum of conversation was low but constant. Behind the counter, Rosie herself, short, round, and always in a flowered apron, moved with practiced efficiency, topping off mugs without being asked. She'd been running the cafe for 20 years and had a soft spot for the town's cops, always slipping an extra slice of pie onto their plates. "Morning, Ethan," Rosie called with a smile. "Cold enough for you out there?" "Colder than I like," he replied, pulling off his gloves and cap. He slid into his usual booth in the back, near the radiator. Jim followed him inside and took a seat at the counter, still muttering about the no-good mutt from the flyer. Two younger men in work coats sat at the next table, one of them laughing. "You see that dog's picture online?" the younger man said. "Looks like he'd bite the hand that fed him. Probably why the county's selling him off like a busted snowblower." His friend snorted. "Bet he won't go for more than $50. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen enough in his years to know how easily people misjudged animals, especially working dogs, based on rumor or fear. Ranger wasn't here to defend himself, and if no one stepped up, there was no telling where he'd end up. Rosie came by with a steaming mug of coffee. "On the house," she said, setting it down. "You look like you've been thinking too hard." "Just saw something on the board," Ethan murmured. "About that dog?" Rosie asked, her expression softening. "I heard about him. Poor thing's been through a lot. Sheriff's office says he was trained for narcotics detection, but after they took down his handlers, he wouldn't work with anyone else, just shut down." Ethan nodded, the image forming in his mind, a proud, capable dog standing alone in a kennel, confused and waiting for someone who would never come. He took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing Cedar Falls in a hush. From his booth, Ethan could see the notice still flapping slightly on the board outside, the black letters stark against the white world. The cafe's door opened again, bringing in a gust of cold air and a man in a postal uniform, Tom Willis, mid-40s, wiry build, wind-chapped face. "Morning, Rosie. Got your mail," Tom said, setting a small stack on the counter. Tom was the type who knew everyone's business without meaning to. His route took him past every house and storefront in town. "You hear about the auction?" Jim called from the counter. "The dog?" Tom nodded. "Yeah. Be a shame if no one decent gets him. He's only 6 years old, still got good years left, but folks don't want the baggage." Ethan glanced up at that. 6 years. Still in his prime. That meant Ranger wasn't some old, worn-out animal. He was still capable, still sharp, which made the thought of him going to the wrong hands all the worse. He finished his coffee, left a bill on the table, and pulled on his gloves. As he stepped outside, the cold hit him again, sharper now. The notice fluttered once more in the wind, and Ethan found himself staring at it longer than he meant to. The auction was Saturday, 3 days away. He told himself it wasn't his problem. Then again, he'd told himself a lot of things before that hadn't been true. Without quite knowing why, Ethan reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and took a picture of the notice. Then he walked back to his SUV, the image of Ranger's name burned into his mind. The snow had stopped by Saturday morning, but the cold hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to make every breath a visible cloud. Cedar Falls Town Square lay at the heart of the community, a broad, open space ringed by 2-story brick buildings, their roofs capped in white. On most weekends it hosted farmers markets or holiday parades. Today it had been transformed into something far less wholesome, a makeshift auction yard with wooden crates stacked into a crude platform and a small crowd already gathering. Ethan Cole stood near the edge, his gloved hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the square. The crowd was a mix of locals and a few out-of-towners, drawn by curiosity or the prospect of a cheap purchase. There was a festive undertone in their chatter, but underneath it ran something meaner, an undercurrent of amusement at the spectacle. At the center of the platform, chained to a short metal post, was Ranger. The German Shepherd stood tall despite the chain, his sable and black coat dulled by neglect but still thick against the cold. His ears were pricked, his tail still, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd as if none of them existed. He was 6 years old, in his prime, with the muscular build of a working dog and the quiet poise of one who had faced worse than this. Ethan's breath caught for a moment. That look steady, far away, unshaken was one he'd seen before, in a K-9 named Duke. Duke had been his temporary partner for 3 months, a bomb detection dog with nerves of steel. The day Duke had been killed on a call, Ethan had sworn he'd never let himself grow that attached to another partner. Yet here he was, feeling the same pull. On the far side of the platform, the auctioneer prepared his notes. Walter Griggs was a wiry man in his early 60s, with a mop of thinning white hair, a thick brown coat, and a voice that could carry over a crowd even without the microphone slung around his neck. He was known for his booming patter and his uncanny ability to get people to bid on things they didn't really want. Today, however, he looked slightly uncomfortable, glancing at Ranger between lines on his clipboard. Near the front, a tall man in a leather jacket shifted his weight from one boot to the other. This was Mark Draven, mid-40s with a weathered face, a hawk-like nose, and narrow eyes that missed little. Draven was a known dog dealer from 2 counties over, specializing in training aggressive breeds for underground fighting circuits. His voice was smooth, but carried a chill when he leaned toward another man and muttered, "I'll turn him mean again in no time." Beside Draven, another bidder stood out, a burly man in a canvas work coat, his hands rough from years of labor. This was Henry Caldwell, owner of a small lumber camp deep in the forest. Henry was known for working his animals hard, often hitching dogs to sleds or carts in the off-season. "Would save me the trouble of buying another mule," he remarked to a neighbor, his tone casual, as though Ranger were just another piece of equipment. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could already see the futures these men offered. The brutality of the fighting pits or the grind of endless labor. Neither was any place for a dog like Ranger. Walter Griggs cleared his throat and stepped onto the platform, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. As ordered by Glenn County Court, we have here a seized asset, a 6-year-old male German Shepherd, name of Ranger, formerly trained as a K-9 for narcotics detection. Bidding starts at $50. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed. "50 for a police reject? I'll give you 20, a voice called from the back, earning a few chuckles. Draven raised a hand. 50. Henry followed almost immediately. 75. From there, the bidding climbed in small grudging increments, 80, 85, 90. Each number felt heavier to Ethan, as though it were a step closer to sealing Ranger's fate. The dog himself stood silent through it all. No barking, no whining, just the occasional shift of weight on his paws. His gaze never met the bidders, as if he knew none of them deserved it. But when his eyes swept the edge of the crowd, they met Ethan's for the briefest moment. Something passed between them, something Ethan couldn't name but recognized all the same. Henry Caldwell made his next bid. 100. Draven smirked. 150. A hush fell. Most of the casual bidders dropped out at that point. 150 was more than they'd pay for a dog with a checkered history. Ethan's hands curled into fists inside his coat. He had no intention of joining the bidding war, not yet, but the idea of watching Draven walk away with Ranger was becoming unbearable. Walter Griggs scanned the crowd. "Do I hear 175? Going once." Before he could finish, a voice from the side cut through the cold air. 175, called a woman in a blue parka, tall and sharp-eyed, with a knit cap pulled over blonde hair. She was Sarah Whitfield, a freelance animal rescuer from a nearby town known for taking in strays and rehoming them. Her presence here was unexpected, and Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Draven's smirk faded. 200. Sarah's jaw tightened. 220. The back and forth between them was quick, almost mechanical. Ethan noticed Ranger's ears flick slightly toward Sarah's voice, but his gaze kept drifting back to the horizon, as though part of him refused to believe anyone here was fighting for his good. The numbers climbed higher, 240, 260, 280. Sarah was determined, but Draven's pockets were deep. Ethan knew she could only go so far before she'd have to stop. When Draven called out 300, Sarah hesitated, That half-second was all it took for Ethan to realize she was at her limit. He stepped forward without thinking, his voice calm but carrying. 350. Heads turned. Walter blinked. 350 from Officer Cole. Draven scowled. 400. 450, Ethan replied, his eyes locked not on Draven, but on Ranger. The bidding stopped there. Draven muttered something under his breath and backed down, clearly unwilling to spend more on a dog he could get elsewhere for cheaper. Walter's voice rang out. Sold to Officer Cole for 450. The chain rattled as the auction assistant, a stocky man named Paul with a thick beard and a faded green jacket, moved to unclip Ranger from the post. Ranger stepped down from the platform with the grace of an animal who still carried himself with dignity, even in defeat. As Ethan took the chain from Paul, he felt the solid weight of it in his hand and the steady, warm presence of Ranger beside him. The dog glanced up once, as if taking his measure, then looked ahead again, walking in sync without a tug. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, their laughter and idle gossip fading into the winter air. Ethan didn't linger. He led Ranger away from the square, each step crunching over snow, the cold air biting at their faces. The auction was over, but the real work had only just begun. The crowd had begun to break apart, boots crunching over the snow as people wandered toward the market stalls or the diner across the square. Ethan stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the chain in his hand. Ranger stood beside him, unmoving, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the buildings. The dog's ears flicked once at the sound of laughter behind them, but otherwise he stayed quiet, as if conserving his energy for something that mattered. Ethan had come here thinking he would quietly outbid the worst of the buyers and take Ranger home without ceremony. But as he glanced toward the platform, where Walter Griggs was already stacking up the auction papers, an idea pushed its way into his mind. A cleaner way to do this, one that would end any doubt about Ranger's future. He handed the chain back to Paul, the stocky auction assistant, and took a slow step toward the platform. Paul, startled, looked at him. "You changing your mind?" "No," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "I'm making it official." The square wasn't empty yet. A few dozen people lingered, including Draven and Henry, who were standing together at the far side. Ethan climbed the steps to the platform and turned to face the remaining onlookers. The cold bit at his cheeks, the air crisp and silent enough that his words would carry without shouting. "I'm taking Ranger," Ethan said, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. "Not through the auction, not through bidding games. I'm turning over my entire service commendation bonus from last month, $4,000, to the Cedar Falls Community Fund in exchange for immediate transfer of this dog into my care." There was a ripple through the crowd's surprise, then a low murmur. The commendation bonus wasn't a small sum, especially for a small-town officer. Ethan could feel eyes on him, measuring his intent. Walter frowned, clearly unsure how to respond. "Officer Cole, this isn't—" Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, its edges worn from being carried in his duty bag. "Glenn County's Emergency Animal Protection Statute," he said. "This gives a certified law enforcement officer the right to take possession of a seized working animal without competitive sale if there's reasonable concern for its welfare. I'm invoking it, and I'm making the donation to avoid any claim of loss for the town." That silenced most of the murmurs. Ethan could see Draven's jaw working, as if he were trying to come up with something to say but kept hitting a wall. Henry just spat into the snow and turned away, muttering under his breath. From near the back of the square, a voice called, "He's right." Matty Ross stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the icy cobblestones. Matty was in his early 50s, lanky and long-armed from decades at a locksmith's bench. His graying hair stuck out from under a knit cap, and his eyes were sharp but good-natured. He'd known Ethan since high school, back when they both played football for the Cedar Falls Ravens. "I'll witness it," Matty said, pulling a small notebook from his jacket. "Always carry one. Habit of the trade." Matty came up beside Ethan, flipping open his notebook and clicking a pen. "State your intent for the record, Ethan." Ethan repeated his offer, word for word. Matty wrote quickly, then scrawled his signature at the bottom. "There you go. Official as the hinges on my shop door," he said, tearing out the page and handing it to Walter. Walter looked between the two men, then down at Ranger, who had remained perfectly still through the entire exchange. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, but you'll handle all the transport and liability yourself." "I will," Ethan said. He stepped down from the platform and took the chain from Paul again. This time, Ranger turned his head slightly, the movement small but deliberate. His amber eyes met Ethan's, holding for a second longer than before. The dog's head tilted just a fraction, as if taking in the man beside him, weighing something invisible. Then, without a sound, he straightened again, ears forward. The gesture was subtle, but Ethan felt it, a tiny shift like the first crack in a wall. Trust in its earliest form. The onlookers began to drift away for real this time. Matty lingered long enough to slap Ethan lightly on the shoulder. "You're a fool," he said, though there was a glint of respect in his eyes. "But maybe the kind of fool this town needs." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Keep that notebook ready. You never know." Matty grinned, then headed off toward his shop. With the square nearly empty, Ethan crouched down slightly to bring himself level with Ranger's head. "Let's get you out of here," he murmured. The dog didn't respond with a wag or a lick, just that same steady gaze, watching him. But Ethan took it for what it was, a beginning. They turned together toward the street, the snow crunching underfoot, the cold air stinging their lungs. Behind them the platform stood empty, the auction papers gone. Ahead lay the road out of the square, and whatever came next. The road out of Cedar Falls was narrow, winding between frozen fields and stands of pine that swayed under the weight of snow. Clouds were gathering again over the ridges, thick and heavy, promising more than just a light dusting before nightfall. Ethan kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the console near the passenger seat where Ranger sat, the chain now replaced with a simple length of braided rope clipped to the dog's collar. The German shepherd sat upright, still as a statue, his amber eyes fixed on the snowy road ahead. He didn't glance at Ethan, but his ears flicked once in response to the rumble of the engine. The cabin appeared after a sharp curve, a single-story wooden structure tucked back among tall firs, its roof already bearing several inches of snow. Built decades ago, it was solid and unpretentious, with a covered porch and a small stone chimney at one end. A split-rail fence enclosed the front yard, though most of it was half buried in drifts. Ethan parked by the porch steps and cut the engine. As he opened the door, the wind immediately reached in, carrying the bite of the coming storm. Ranger jumped down onto the packed snow, landing lightly despite his size, and paused to take in the surroundings. His nose worked the air, and his gaze swept the tree line before returning to Ethan, as if silently acknowledging that this was unfamiliar territory. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, the air carrying the faint scent of wood and old pine resin. The main room was simple: a worn couch, a sturdy oak table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and a few framed photographs. The hearth was dark, the ashes cold. Ethan set down his gloves and hat on the table and moved to the fireplace, stacking kindling and logs. "This place gets warm fast once the fire's going," he said, more to fill the silence than expecting a reaction. Ranger padded slowly around the room, inspecting each corner with deliberate caution. His coat was thick but not immune to the cold, and Ethan could see the way his breath clouded the air. When the first flames caught, flickering orange against the stone, Ethan stood and pulled a thick wool blanket from a cedar chest in the corner. It was heavy and soft, patterned in faded red and gray stripes. He placed it on the rug near the hearth, then fetched a metal bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water from the kettle. Setting it beside the blanket, he crouched down. "Here," he said quietly. Ranger approached with measured steps, sniffing the bowl before taking a cautious sip. His tail remained still, his body poised for retreat if needed, but he didn't pull away. After another drink, he lowered himself onto the blanket, the firelight catching the faint scars along his flank-thin, pale lines that told of more than one violent encounter. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows in their frames. Snow tapped against the glass, at first in light bursts, then in a steady hiss. The sky darkened early, the storm swallowing the last of the daylight. Ethan moved around the kitchen, putting together a simple dinner. Stew warmed on the stove, bread reheated by the fire. The smell filled the cabin, mingling with the wood smoke. Ranger lay with his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but not fully closed. When Ethan sat down with his bowl, the dog's gaze lifted briefly to follow him, then settled again. It was a small thing, but to Ethan it felt like progress, a sign that Ranger wasn't just tolerating his presence, but acknowledging it. Later, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the porch, Ethan set an extra log on the fire and dimmed the lamps. He stretched out on the couch with a blanket, listening to the storm. For a while, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the muffled roar of the wind. Somewhere in the night, a low sound broke through, a whimper, sharp and abrupt. Ethan sat up, scanning the room. Ranger was on his blanket, paws twitching, breath quickened, a faint growl rumbling in his throat even as his eyes remained closed. Ethan rose quietly, moving to kneel beside him. "Easy," he murmured, placing a steady hand on the dog's back. Ranger's muscles were taut under his palm, but at the touch the growl faded, the twitching slowed. After a moment, the dog's breathing eased back into a slow rhythm. Ethan stayed there for a while, his hand resting gently against the rise and fall of Ranger's ribs. In the soft glow of the firelight, he saw again the scars, the wear in the fur around his neck where a collar had once sat too tight. He thought of Rosie's words, just shut down, and understood more of what they meant. This was not just a dog with training. This was a survivor, carrying wounds that couldn't all be seen. When he finally returned to the couch, Ethan left one arm draped over the side so his hand hung near the floor, within Ranger's reach if he needed it. Sometime later, he felt the faintest brush of fur against his fingers. It might have been accidental, but Ethan chose to believe otherwise. By morning, the storm had buried the fence and left the world outside wrapped in white silence. Inside, the fire still glowed in the hearth, and Ranger was stretched out on the blanket, his body no longer curled tight but relaxed in the warmth. Ethan watched him for a moment before getting up to stoke the fire. This was still a long way from trust, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. By mid-morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest draped in a quiet, crystalline stillness. Sunlight filtered weakly through the pines, turning the fresh snow into a sheet of pale gold. Ethan had just finished stacking firewood inside the porch when Ranger's ears pricked toward the driveway. The dog's body tensed, head high, eyes fixed on the faint crunch of footsteps coming up the path. A man emerged from between the trees, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He was in his late 40s, of medium build but with a wiry, restless energy. His face was thin, weathered, and framed by close-cropped dark hair peppered with gray. A deep scar ran from the corner of his left eye to his jawline, an old injury that gave him a permanent sneer. He wore a black wool coat that hung open despite the cold, and his gloved hands were thrust casually into his pockets. Ethan recognized him before the man even reached the porch. Vince Mallory. Vince was a name known to every cop in Glenn County, a mid-level narcotics trafficker with a history of intimidation and a knack for slipping out of charges on technicalities. Ethan had nearly caught him 2 years ago during a raid on a storage facility, but Vince had vanished into the night before the cuffs could close. That scar was a memento from the scuffle with another officer. Vince stopped at the base of the steps, his boots leaving wet indentations in the snow. "Officer Cole," he said, his tone smooth but laced with mockery. "Heard you've got something of mine." Ethan stayed still, one hand resting on the porch rail. "Don't think so. I do." Vince's eyes flicked toward the doorway, where Ranger now stood. The German shepherd's hackles rose immediately, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. His stance was forward, legs planted firmly, tail low but rigid. "That's my dog," Vince continued, smiling faintly. "Used to be part of my security team before your friends in the sheriff's office stole him. I'll be back with paperwork to prove it. Court orders, chain of ownership, the works." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He's not yours anymore." Vince's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. "We'll see about that." He turned, crunching back down the path without another word, leaving only the faint smell of cigarette smoke and something colder, more dangerous. Ranger stayed in the doorway until Vince disappeared from sight. Only then did the dog glance at Ethan, his ears still rigid, the low hum of his growl fading reluctantly. Ethan stepped inside and closed the door. "Yeah," he said quietly, meeting Ranger's gaze. "I don't trust him either." Before the tension could settle, the landline phone rang from the kitchen, a rare event since most calls came through his radio or cell. Ethan picked up, hearing the strained voice of Mary Halverson, the widow who lived 2 houses down the dirt road. Mary was in her late 50s, a petite woman with silver hair tied back in a braid and a warm but nervous way about her. "Ethan," she said, "have you seen Oliver? He didn't come home from school yesterday. I called the bus driver. He said Oliver got off at the stop near the main road, but no one's seen him since." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "How long has he been missing?" "Almost 24 hours now," Mary said, her voice trembling. "I thought maybe he'd gone to a friend's house, but I've called everyone I can think of. The sheriff's office said they'd send someone this afternoon, but I don't want to wait that long." Ethan's mind immediately began piecing details together. Vince showing up this morning, Oliver missing since yesterday. The location of the bus stop, close to one of the side roads that led toward town. The connection wasn't proven, but it was enough to spark suspicion. "I'll come by in 10 minutes, Ethan said, "and Mary, keep your door locked until I get there." When he hung up, Ranger was already standing near the coat rack, tail stiff, watching Ethan with alert eyes as if reading his intent. "We're going to check on something," Ethan told him, pulling on his jacket. They stepped out into the brittle cold, the snow squeaking under their boots and paws. As they walked toward the SUV, Ethan's thoughts kept circling back to Vince Mallory. Men like him didn't make house calls without a reason, and his sudden claim on Ranger felt like more than coincidence. Ranger hopped into the back seat without needing a command, sitting upright as they drove down the narrow road toward Mary's property. The pines gave way to a clearing where her small, pale yellow farmhouse sat under a sloping roof of snow. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, and Mary was already on the porch, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her hands wringing together. She explained again what she knew, her words coming in short bursts. Oliver was 9, tall for his age, with sandy blonde hair and a gap-toothed smile. He'd been wearing a red parka and carrying his school backpack when last seen. The bus driver had assumed he was heading home as usual. Ethan nodded, taking mental notes. "I'll start at the bus stop and work from there. If you think of anyone who might have seen him, call me right away." As they left the property, Ranger shifted closer to the window, nose working at the cold air seeping through the vent. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, posture tense. Ethan noticed the subtle change in the dog's breathing, the way his body leaned ever so slightly forward. When they reached the bus stop, a lonely stretch where the snow had been trampled by boots, Ranger jumped down and began sniffing with deliberate focus. He moved in widening circles, nose low, tail steady. At one spot near the edge of the trees he paused, nostrils flaring, and looked back at Ethan. The dog's body language was unmistakable. He had picked up a trail. Ethan scanned the ground, noting tire tracks half hidden by new snow leading toward the direction of the old mill road, a route that would eventually skirt the outskirts of Cedar Falls, not far from where Vince was known to have contacts. The pattern was too neat to be chance. Vince arrives in the morning, making a show of claiming Ranger. A boy disappears the day before. Now, Ranger had found something leading toward Vince's territory. Ethan crouched beside him, resting a hand briefly on the thick fur of his neck. "Good work," he murmured. Ranger's ears flicked forward at the praise, and he turned back toward the trail, waiting. Ethan stood, eyes narrowing toward the dark line of trees in the distance. Whatever Vince Mallory was planning, it had just become more personal. By the time the sun dipped below the ridge, the cold had deepened into a biting, metallic chill. The sky was clear again, stars pricking through the blackness, and the moon cast a pale light over the snow-covered ground. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the radio scanner hissing quietly beside him. Then the sheriff's voice cut through, flat and urgent. "Be advised, Glenn County is issuing an official missing person alert for Oliver Halverson, 9 years old, last seen wearing a red parka. All units keep watch and report immediately." Ethan didn't waste time. He stood, grabbed his coat, and Ranger was on his feet before Ethan could call him. The dog's amber eyes were bright, his posture alert, as if he understood exactly what the radio had just said. They headed out to the SUV, the engine rumbling in the stillness. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from distant chimneys, but it was the faint, lingering trail near the bus stop that Ethan wanted to follow before more snow could cover it. He parked at the edge of the road, unclipped Ranger's lead, and gave a quiet command. "Track." Ranger lowered his head, nostrils flaring, paws crunching into the snow. The path he took was deliberate, weaving through the trees in a way no human would choose unless they were trying to avoid being seen. Ethan followed closely, flashlight sweeping over the frozen ground. They moved deeper into the forest until the trees thinned, revealing a sagging chain-link fence half-collapsed under years of neglect. Beyond it stood a weathered warehouse, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, windows boarded over with warped plywood. This was the old Miller & Sons supply depot, abandoned after a fire gutted part of its roof 15 years ago. Most locals avoided it. Rumors said transients and small-time crooks used it as a hideout. Ranger slowed near the side entrance, a door hanging crooked on its hinges. He sniffed at the threshold, ears flattening slightly, and let out a low, steady growl. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and the faint tang of oil. Ethan's flashlight beam danced across the floor, catching broken pallets, stacks of old crates, and tire tracks etched into the grime. His boot scraped over something soft, an empty burlap sack, its fibers rough and stained. Kneeling, Ethan examined the ground. Footprints, men's size, heavy tread moved in and out of the side door. Some were fresh, edges still crisp in the dust. He found another sack tossed near the wall, and in the corner, a child's mitten, red and slightly damp. His stomach tightened. Ranger had moved ahead, his nose working rapidly, tail stiff. He stopped near a stack of warped wooden planks leaning against the far wall. Without warning, he barked sharply once, then again, his voice echoing through the hollow space. Ethan hurried over, the beam of his light sweeping the boards. One near the middle was looser than the rest, the nails rusted and bent. The dog pressed his muzzle to the gap, sniffing intently, then pawed at the floor. Ethan knelt, running his hand over the wood until he found a spot that shifted slightly. With a firm pull, the plank gave way, revealing a narrow opening. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it a faint scent musty, with the sharper edge of fear and unwashed fabric. He leaned closer, angling the light downward. A short flight of steps descended into darkness. Somewhere below, he thought he heard movement small, quick, like someone shifting against the floor. Ethan's voice was low but firm. "Oliver?" No answer. Then, after a beat, the faintest sound, a muffled whimper. Ranger's body went taut, his gaze locked on the opening. His tail was stiff, his ears forward, but there was no hesitation. Ethan clipped the lead back onto his collar. "Easy," he murmured, then started down the steps, Ranger moving just ahead of him, every muscle coiled with purpose. The cellar was cramped, the ceiling low, the walls made of rough concrete. A single bulb hung overhead, unlit, its cord swaying slightly as if disturbed recently. In the far corner, huddled against the wall, was a small figure in a red parka. His knees were pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around them, and a strip of duct tape covered his mouth. Ethan moved quickly, keeping his voice calm. "Oliver, it's okay. I'm Officer Cole. You're safe now." He knelt, gently peeling the tape away. The boy flinched at first, then blinked up at him with wide, tear-bright eyes. Ranger sat close, his body between Ethan and the rest of the room, as if daring anything to come near. The boy's gaze flicked to the dog, and some of the fear seemed to drain from his expression. You brought a police dog," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Ethan managed a small smile. "Yeah. His name's Ranger, and he's the reason we found you." Oliver's voice shook. "There were 2 men. They said I had to be quiet." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "We'll talk about that later. Let's get you home." He slipped off his coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, then motioned for Ranger to lead the way back up the stairs. The cold night air hit them like a wall when they emerged from the warehouse. Snow crunched underfoot as they moved quickly toward the SUV, Ethan glancing back only once to see the dark shape of the building against the sky. Ranger stayed close to Oliver the entire walk, brushing against his side in a silent reassurance. As Ethan started the engine, he looked into the rearview mirror. Ranger sat beside Oliver, the boy leaning against his thick fur, eyes already beginning to close from exhaustion. Ethan knew this wasn't over, not with Vince Mallory still out there, but for tonight. One thing was certain. They had found the boy. Morning light broke over Cedar Falls in a brittle pale wash, the kind of winter dawn that felt too cold to carry any warmth. Ethan stood on the courthouse steps, collar turned up against the wind, with Ranger sitting quietly at his side. The German shepherd's posture was straight and calm, but Ethan could feel the steady alertness in him, the slight flick of an ear at every sound, the slow, deliberate way his gaze swept over the people gathering at the entrance. Inside, the main courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The walls were lined with tall windows that let in the thin light, casting it across rows of benches. At the front sat Judge Harold McIntyre, a man in his early 60s with a square jaw, steel-gray hair combed neatly back, and deep-set eyes that could shift from kindly to cutting in an instant. He was respected for his fairness, but known for his impatience with anything that smelled of dishonesty. Vince Mallory was already seated at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a dark charcoal suit that fit too well for a man claiming hardship. His hair was slicked back, the scar on his face almost hidden under makeup, but his eyes gave him away, sharp, cold, assessing. Beside him sat a younger man in a blue tie, holding a slim leather briefcase. This was Joel Price, a defense attorney from the county seat, clean-cut and efficient-looking, with an expression that suggested he enjoyed the sparring match of court more than the actual cause he was representing. Ethan took his seat at the defense table, flanked by Marianne Keller, the town's part-time municipal lawyer. Marianne was in her mid-40s, tall and spare, with dark hair streaked in silver and an air of quiet determination. Years ago, she'd been a prosecutor in Denver, but after a messy divorce and burnout from city politics, she'd returned to Cedar Falls to work cases that mattered more to her than to any political ladder. Her sharp brown eyes missed nothing, and her voice, measured, deliberate, had a way of making juries lean forward. Judge McIntyre called the case to order, his voice firm. Mr. Mallory claims lawful ownership of the animal in question, known as Ranger. Officer Cole, represented by Ms. Keller, disputes this and asserts the animal is an active service dog under municipal authority. Vince's attorney stood, sliding a few papers onto the judge's bench. Your Honor, here are the registration documents, dated 2 years prior, listing my client as the lawful owner of the dog. The animal was wrongfully seized during a raid in which no conviction was made against my client. We demand immediate return of the property. Marianne rose smoothly. Your Honor, those documents are fraudulent. Beyond that, the dog in question is not property in the sense Mr. Mallory claims he is an active working animal, currently serving with Officer Cole. And yesterday, Ranger was directly responsible for locating and rescuing a missing 9-year-old boy. The judge looked up sharply. You have proof of this claim? Yes, Your Honor, Marianne said, stepping aside as the courtroom doors opened. Mary Halverson entered, her face pale but composed, followed closely by Oliver, bundled in his red parka, and a uniformed deputy escort. The boy walked slowly, still looking tired, but when his eyes found Ranger, his face lit with something unguarded. Ranger's ears perked, his tail giving a slow, single sweep before returning to stillness. Ethan felt the shift in the room, an almost imperceptible softening of posture from the people in the benches, a pause in the shuffle of papers. Mary took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted the events, the missed bus arrival, the search, the fear mounting by the hour. Then Oliver was sworn in, his small hands gripping the edge of the witness chair. His voice was quiet at first, but when asked what happened, he glanced toward Ranger and spoke more firmly. "I was scared," Oliver said. "They told me not to talk, but then I heard barking loud, like it was calling to me. And then I saw him. He found me." The room was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's keys. Even Judge McIntyre's expression shifted slightly, though his voice remained level. "So this dog located you in an enclosed space?" "Yes, sir," Oliver replied, his eyes still on Ranger. "If he hadn't, I don't think I'd be here." Mary Ann let the words hang for a moment before submitting the incident report from the sheriff's office, along with photographs from the warehouse showing the hidden entrance and the boy's location. Vince's attorney attempted to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge cut him off with a look. "It's directly relevant if the dog is being used in active service. Continue." Ethan was called next. He detailed the search, Ranger's tracking work, and the moment the dog signaled at the loose plank. His testimony was concise but firm, every word underscoring Ranger's capability and the trust required in such operations. Ranger, for his part, sat calmly at Ethan's side, the picture of composure alert but not restless, embodying the discipline of his training. When Mary Ann concluded, the judge leaned back, folding his hands. "Mr. Mallory, even if your documentation were genuine, which I find questionable given inconsistencies in these filings, the evidence presented shows that Ranger is engaged in official duties as part of law enforcement operations. That makes him exempt from seizure or private claim." Vince's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Judge McIntyre's gavel came down lightly. "The claim is denied. Ranger will remain with Officer Cole under municipal authority." There was a murmur in the gallery, and Oliver broke into a small smile. Mary reached for her son's hand, relief written plainly across her face. Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time in days. As the room began to clear, Ranger turned his head up toward Ethan, their eyes meeting briefly. It wasn't the wary look from the auction square, nor the cautious glance from the night in the cabin. This was something steadier acknowledgement, maybe even the beginning of trust. Ethan gave the chain a gentle tug. "Come on, partner, let's go home." The cold outside the courthouse bit sharply, but for Ethan, the air felt clearer than it had in weeks. The tension that had coiled in his shoulders since the day of the auction finally began to loosen. Ranger walked at his side, his steady gait matching Ethan's, each step leaving crisp impressions in the snow. The German shepherd's ears flicked to every sound, the shuffle of boots, the hiss of a passing car on icy asphalt, but there was no trace of the guarded distance he'd shown before. They stopped briefly on the courthouse steps as Mary Ann Keller joined them, pulling on a pair of leather gloves against the cold. Her breath puffed in small clouds as she offered a faint smile. "Congratulations, Officer Cole. Not every day I get to see justice land where it belongs." She glanced at Ranger, her eyes softening. "And you don't let him slack off on the job." Ranger blinked once, his head tilting slightly, as if he understood the joke. Ethan chuckled. "Thank you, Mary Ann. Couldn't have done it without you." "You could have," she said matter-of-factly, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." With that, she turned back toward the courthouse, her tall figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the pale morning sky. The drive home took them along the winding forest road, where sunlight filtered through the pines, throwing moving shadows across the snow. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had taken on the faint lavender hue of approaching dusk. Ethan parked beside the porch, cutting the engine. Ranger jumped down, landing lightly, his breath steaming in the chill air. Inside, the cabin was still warm from the fire Ethan had banked before leaving. He set his gloves on the table and hung his coat on the rack. Ranger padded in behind him, giving the room a slow, sweeping glance as if confirming it was still theirs. Ethan moved to the small shelf above the fireplace. There, in a simple wooden frame, was a photograph of Anna, her dark hair tucked behind one ear, her smile quiet but warm. Beside it hung his service medal from the year they'd met, a symbol of a time that felt like another life. From a drawer, Ethan pulled out a new frame. Inside it was a photograph taken just after the court session, a quick snapshot from Deputy Harris, showing Ethan standing with Ranger at his side, both facing the camera. Ethan wasn't smiling broadly, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in a long time. Ranger, alert and steady, looked every bit the partner he now officially was. Ethan placed the photo beside Anna's and the medal, arranging them with care. For a moment, he just stood there, the firelight flickering over the small collection. It felt like a quiet promise, one part of his life he'd lost, and one he'd just found, side by side. Later, Ethan sat at the table with the paperwork from the courthouse spread before him. The registration was now official. Ranger, Canine Partner, Cedar Falls Police Department. The signature line bore Ethan's name, bold and final. He traced the letters with a thumb, then glanced toward the hearth. Ranger was lying on his blanket, eyes half closed, but he opened them when he felt Ethan's gaze. The dog's tail swept once across the floor, slow and content. "You're not just a case file anymore," Ethan said quietly. "You're my partner." The rest of the evening passed in easy rhythm. Ethan made dinner simple beef stew and set aside a portion of plain meat for Ranger, who accepted it with a dignified calm before settling back onto his blanket. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes catching in the light from the windows. Before turning in, Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The forest was silent except for the faint whisper of the snowfall. He thought about the road that had led here, the auction square, the warehouse, the courtroom. Each moment had felt like a choice, and together they'd brought him to this one. When he came back inside, Ranger had moved from his blanket to lie near the foot of the couch where Ethan would sleep. It was the first time the dog had closed that gap entirely. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, leaning down to rest a hand on the thick fur between Ranger's ears. "Welcome home, Ranger," he said. The dog's eyes closed briefly, a soft exhale of breath the only reply. It was enough. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with bright lights or loud fanfare. They come quietly, in the form of a second chance, a loyal friend, or the courage to open your heart again. Just as God placed Ranger in Ethan's path at the exact moment they both needed each other, He often works in our lives in ways we can't predict, weaving protection, healing, and hope into our everyday moments. In our own lives, we can be that answered prayer for someone, human or animal, who feels lost or abandoned. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe for more stories of faith, hope, and love. May God bless you and keep you, and if you believe in His power to bring the right souls together at the right time, type Amen in the comments.